over to the seminar for today, which is entitled Decentring the Human in Social Science. We've got three great talks. The first from Professor Clarke, who's a professor in organisation studies with the Open University, with a talk entitled Organising Anthropocentrism. That will be followed by Dr. Matthew Cole, a lecturer in criminology with social policy and criminology at the Open University. The talk is entitled Decentering the Human on Social Science Research. And then Professor Janet Sayers is going to finish the three talks with furry families towards multi-species subjectivity. Janet is a professor with the School of Management at Massey University in New Zealand. So very welcome to all three speakers. Really delighted to be part of this session. And I'll hand over to Clarke. I think we're going to go with about 10 to 12 minutes for each talk. So I'll give you a 2-minute warning on the 10-minute mark, and then probably 15 minutes. I'll be a bit.
No, I won't go.
That's okay. Over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me here today. And in some ways, weirdly, it feels like I'm coming home because I was an OU student, and my first module was D103. Stuart Hall back in the 90s. I don't know how I wandered into a business school, but I'm there anyway. So 10 minutes isn't very much. I'm not going to talk about everything that is in the paper that I'm working on with Matthew and Richard Longman and Charles Bartol from FBL. So just to focus really on what the seminar is about decentering the human, and I was kind of thinking, okay, what does that mean really? What does it mean practically, which was part of the brief of the seminar. So I think there's two really quite powerful statements up there that I'll let you read. But essentially, we're talking about most of our problems that we're experiencing right now would not be taking place, at least to the level they are now, were it not for our anthropocentric attitude towards everything around us. Now, I didn't know how much you knew about anthropocentrism, so you might be thinking this is a bit boring. We know all this. I just don't know. So I'm just going to lay the groundwork a bit. So anthropocentrism, as in, we're the centre of everything, leads to anthropogenic activity which harms the earth. So it's like, if you like, man-made. And I suppose we could be thinking about things like species extinction, climate change, deforestation, ocean acidification, pollution, pandemics. I'm going to talk mainly about pandemics today, but I thought, what better way could research become a service than for helping us understand why the future of all living species is actually at risk. Okay, so, I don't know what, sorry, I'll put animation in here, I thought I'm going to be busy for a minute. Okay, so on the left, we've got the typical view of anthropocentrism, and it's where humans think they can stand outside of what we call nature. You'll notice man at the top, woman on the second row, and then we have the kind of antithesis of this, which is that humans, not apart from nature, but are a part of nature. So there's no hierarchy there. So at the same time as being the centre of the world, we've kind of put ourselves at the top of the world, and everything else is other. So if it's animal, vegetable, mineral, etc., it's the other and it's inferior to us. But I think what's missing from this view of anthropocentrism in a way is the fact that humans are much more complicated in this hierarchy. So we have treat many groups of humans as a resource and exploit them as well. So it's not as though all humans have this privilege. Now, the problem we've got is that many ethical theories, particularly those used in business school, like consequentialism and virtue ethics and principle-based ethics, they only focus on the human. So they don't do anything to disturb anthropocentrism when they're thinking about what is ethical and what isn't ethical. So non-anthropocentric ethical perspective, such as posthumanism, attempts to break down these artificial boundaries between us and so-called nature, or if you like, specifically the animal, and to recognise that we have interconnections and embodied entanglement with everything. And I think we're kind of learning that lesson right now, because we think we can take for granted everything we use as a resource, which leads to anthropogenic activity. Okay, so next slide. Okay, just not going to dwell on this. Sorry you're not in there, Matthew, on critical animals, but this is about business ethics. So we have a variety of things, ecocentrism, etc., that challenge this notion of anthropocentrism. And I think one of the interesting things around all this is to think about not just anthropocentrism on its own, but how it's kind of interweaved with another very dominant, oppressive kind of perspective of capitalism. This is not on my ideas, badly well. So how do these systems of oppression dominate and collide through processes of commodification and violence against animals, for example? So the factory farm is what Waddiwell says is where capitalism shakes hands with anthropocentrism, and I think that's quite a powerful thing. So together they are an even deadlier force than they are on their own. In fact, Waddiwell talks about this war of domination and death against animals. The problem is that humans, like all identities, define themselves by what they are not. Stuart Hall would say the constitutive outside. We can only define ourselves by what we aren't. So, and we like to think we're not animals, but actually, weirdly, of course, we are animals. So, using COVID as an example, we saw the institutional compulsion to continue production, even at the risk of human lives. And this highlighted the system imperative of global violence against animals to continue. So even when it wasn't safe to do so in many respects, and those people working with animals obviously more at risk, we carried on anyway, and I think we carried on pretty much with everything that we could. So sticking with the pandemic and entanglements, you'll see there the United Nations, they issued a report called Stopping the Next Pandemic, and that was in June 2020. So they weren't even thinking about COVID, they were thinking like, why do we keep getting these? So, you know, we can think that there is no external environment, and that showed up very clearly during the pandemic when these, I can't pronounce the word, but biomes, whatever, you know, we have them in our gut, but then we can't even see them, and they made this massive impact. And pandemics have happened before, but they're accelerating hugely in the way we have this relationship with animals. As long as we keep on doing what we're doing, you know, the genie is out of the bottle now, so it's hard to think how we can do much without really taking some radical action. And we could take that action if we recognise how intimately entangled we are with everything and everyone on the planet. So to hurt to inflict violence on part of the planet or somebody or an animal is to inflict violence on ourselves, in a sense, from this post-humanist perspective. What happened there?
One of the screens went off.
Okay, can you? So, yeah, our complicitous silence in all this as academics is also quite worrying. That's particularly in the business school, as we obfuscate the reality. So here's some of, very quickly, why do we keep getting zoonotic disease? You'll see that 6 out of those are to do with animals, or 5 to 6. So the relationship we have with animals is extremely problematic. And if you just go to the next slide, please. Yeah, don't expect you to be able to read all this, but the bottom line is that humans have to think about how they treat their animals. The whole relationship between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom is coming under stress, and we've created that. That's a quote from the UN report, and you can see there are different things like deforestation and destruction of habitats, and other anthropogenic activity. And I saw a nice meme the other day that was an animal saying, if you come and destroy my home, don't be surprised when I come to yours. And I think, yeah, that is quite true, actually. So, so last slide. What I haven't talked about is what the paper is mainly about. But I can say more, and you know, you can, if you want to know more, you can contact me or chat. It's really about how we keep this anthropocentrism going. And we're very interested in deliberate manufacture of ignorance by keeping people ignorant about the risks of harm to ourselves, to animals, to the planet, is kept going by, you know, the nexus of capitalism and anthropocentrism. So making money, basically. Don't tell people tobacco kills you. Don't tell people it's unhealthy to eat animals. It's not good for animals, obviously, or us, or the environment. But you know, the meat marketing board's got a lot to say about that. So we look at different techniques like silencing, and how do you silence people on these matters? You know, you can arrest them, you can stop them protesting, you can undermine them. There are a few strategies. And so, for example, ExxonMobil knew in 1970s how much our planet was going to warm up. Almost exactly. What did they do with that knowledge? It disappeared, or it was rendered absent. It's there, but it was rendered absent. And so the paper looks very much at how we use these, how these strategies are used to hide, in a way, what's going on. And as Benatar said, it's changing the way we actually do stuff, and that includes treating animals. It's really off the radar. So when we got a pandemic, there was no discussion about how we got a pandemic. All the discussions turned to technological fix of vaccines, rather than, oh, hang on, and we know we're going to get more, and it could be deadlier, and they could be more frequent, but still we're not talking about this. So that's basically what I wanted to say about how we can decenter the human in our research to actually be of service to these massive problems that we have now. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Over to Matthew.
Yep. Thanks, Caroline. So what I wanted to talk about was some of the ways that we can, and I would say should, rise to these huge challenges that Caroline has outlined there. You know, a threat to pretty much all life on Earth, really. It doesn't get much more serious than that. So I'm going to talk about, in that vein, the development of a vegan standpoint methodology. So how have I got to this, or how am I working towards this? Well, largely this is through my work with Kate Stewart, my partner, another vegan sociologist working at UEA. And we've been publishing on this since 2009, working on it, of course, for a few years before that, as these things go, before we got published. There's a few examples of things we've done on this slide here. And what our work together has always been about is opposing speciesism, opposing the social structures that legitimate the exploitation of non-human animals that has led us to this disastrous current situation. But when we were doing that work, we didn't quite realise what we were doing methodologically in this more kind of conceptual sense. So I think what we've always been doing is implicitly forging this vegan methodological standpoint, but we never actually kind of spelled out what that actually meant. So this is what we're now trying to do, or have been trying to do recently. And it's probably evident from the phrase, we're drawing on other standpoint traditions which are very well established and have a long and proud history in the social sciences, with that general approach to expose and critique epistemological privilege. So who is constructing knowledge and from what positions of power and so forth, and those need to be interrogated. And what we think is that this is a necessary response to the history of anthropocentrism within the social sciences, which is not uniform, of course, and it has been troubled, destabilised at various points, but that needs to accelerate like rapidly now, which is what we're hoping to effect with our work. And also, as Caroline again was saying, how can we make this work of service? So one of the things we're hoping is that developing this VSM, to save time, use the acronym, is that we can be of service to activists, for example. So in that spirit, I was just at a vegan animal rights conference, that's what's in brackets on the slide there, in Manchester this last weekend. I felt very, very lucky to be there as one of relatively few academics amongst a lot of very inspiring activists, but being able to make some of my research of use to them and have them interested and think, oh, there's something we might be able to do with this is like, you know, exactly what I want to be doing. So that was very exciting and inspiring. So a bit more about the background behind developing this standpoint. These are some of the things that we think we can achieve with it, or achieve perhaps better than the social sciences have managed thus far. We can get closer to understanding how non-human animals are constructed through discourses and practices by paying attention to those discourses and practices, by treating the way that non-human animals are constructed as significant, legitimate topics to study. And it's through those constructions that non-human animals are exploited. Those constructions legitimate their exploitation and position them figuratively and literally in space, on factory farms, in laboratories, in zoos, and all the other ways in which they're used and abused. But also, we're interested in how human exceptionalism, or anthropocentrism, if you like, is also constructed through that process in relation to othered non-humans. And here we see intersections with intrahuman inequalities, which are relatively better studied thus far in the social sciences, but of course still with a great deal of work to do also. And of course that list, gender, race, class, is far from exhaustive. And we're also interested in how we can engage with the social from a critical vegan perspective. So if we start from that position, how does that change the way the social looks to us? And it changes it in profound ways. It brings non-human animals into focus, for one thing, but that is a very significant thing because they are with us in their millions and indeed trillions on this planet, and we tend not to be cognizant of that all the time. And then also we're hoping to help other researchers through doing this. So happily, we're part of communities of increasing numbers of vegan researchers in sociology, criminology, and other disciplines, and we want to be something that's of service to them, that can help them ground their methodology, ground their research, and kind of, you know, make it look persuasive. So getting to the substance of the principles, these are the 8 that we've developed so far, and I'm not going to have time to kind of go through each of these one by one. But in a nutshell, they're kind of oriented in 4 different directions, if you like, which is why I've grouped them in these 4 pairs. So the first 2 speak directly towards other animals. So the first principle is that our research ought to be supportive of non-human animals. We ought to be conceiving of them as the beneficiaries of our research from this standpoint. They are who we are working for. And related to that, we need as researchers a species consciousness, to be reflexively aware of the fact that we are human animals working from positions of power and privilege that grants to us, but also be aware that other species have their own consciousnesses, which in some respects may be similar to ours and in other respects quite different. The second pairing is directed towards other researchers, other vegan sociologists and other disciplines. I still kind of identify as a sociologist more than anything, and Kate very definitely is a sociologist, so that's why that word is still in there. But I think this applies across disciplines. Well, we hope so. So in that regard, we're encouraging, if you like, a social constructionist epistemology. So a recognition that the ways we conceive of other animals are human social constructs. These are not. Sorry?
Sorry, someone online might have their microphone.
Yeah, I think there was an unmuting issue there. Sorry, I lost my thread temporarily. Yeah, so other animals don't construct themselves in ways that satisfy human needs. You know, we construct them in ways that satisfy our own desires, generally speaking. And also an awareness that this happens within social structures. I hope self-evident, and I feel like I need to speed up anyway. So the next pairing, understanding in research. So there's a very strong emphasis on empathy here, on interspecies empathy, and a recognition again of where similarities exist or where we have evidence of similarities. We should take those on board in terms of capacities to feel, emotions, pain, to have a complex intellectual life, cultural experience and so forth, but also to recognise difference where there are unknowable, ineffable differences between species, and to respect those and to recognise that other animals have ways of being in the world that we cannot fully sympathise with, and that doesn't make them any less legitimate for that, just because they don't fit into our frames of understanding. And then the sixth one, going back to that kind of part of the roots of these principles, to recognise intersectionality and complexity, to pull back from what is sometimes a risk or a temptation to treat these issues as a single issue. They're not single issue. So as Caroline was saying, if you remember her diagram on an early slide, that figure of man at the top is quite deliberate: whiteness, masculinity, heteronormativity, and so forth. It's particular forms of being human that are more privileged than others, and the ways in which those characteristics intersect have profound effects. So species is part of what intersects with those characteristics, but we're not arguing here that it obliterates those other characteristics. It certainly does not. So that all needs to be taken on board. And then the final pairing, directed towards the academy, are institutional settings, if you like. So we need to be paying attention to research ethics processes in terms of including non-human animals within them. I suppose what we're arguing is it's no longer legitimate to treat them as of no account. They have to be brought into any kind of consideration of what are the ethical impacts of research. And that in turn has implications for research governance, including research committees who are approving research funding and giving ethical approval to research and so on. So I might get a chance to say a little bit more on that, but I don't run out of time.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay, so very, very quickly. So this is an example of where we've kind of transmuted these principles into an analytical framework. So in this chapter, we've looked at film representations of vegans, in fact, and also reflected back on some of our earlier work looking at representation of non-human animal characters, especially in children's animated films, and animal characters are all over those. So we're being recorded, so that's great. So at a future day, you can pause and look at this in more detail, and I won't attempt to read through it. But basically, the first 7 principles proved to be very amenable to slightly rejigging into this analytical framework as a way of looking at mass media. Basically, it seemed to work. And as you can see, there are speciesist antitheses to the vegan theses, if you like. So they sort of work as ideal types. So we looked at Babe, famous children's film, for example, and a bunch of other stuff. The Lion King fits perfectly in the antithesis side. The Lion King's like the most evil bit of media I've ever encountered. And one of the things that inspired me to get into all this when I first saw it in the cinema, I came out thinking, there's something very wrong going on here. And here I am 20 years later still talking about it. So yeah, I don't have time, but just to go back to research governance, which didn't really fit into that representational schema. This is some of what it might mean. So from Catherine Oliver's work, another vegan scholar, she's proposed that non-human animals ought to be included as participants in research and not mere kind of background, not full participants, you know, such as animal companions and so forth, need to be brought in, recognised as participants if we're doing research in households with other animals and so forth. And we need to reimagine our methodological practice as multi-species, which is something I think Janet's going to come on to talk about. And as I was saying, review the way we do ethical review as institutions. And this provocative final point, I guess, the most controversial bit possibly, is that if these principles are not being respected, then we need to think very, very carefully about whether we're funding research any longer. Given the scale of the crisis that Caroline has outlined, you know, we're at a desperate situation for life on Earth. And just to conclude, so we've spoken about this in a conference paper and there's that chapter, but we're still working on a journal article to codify these principles, if you like. Of course, it is iterative, so this is based on reflecting on the work we've done and also reading, of course, the work of many others. And I'm sure it will develop. By no means are we saying these are perfect and fit for purpose for all time, but we hope it's a good start that others can be inspired by and draw on. And I'll leave it there.
Over to Mr. Janet Sayers, who press the keyboard down.
Welcome everybody and thank you for being here. Welcome to everyone in the three-dimensional space and in the two-dimensional space. To everyone that's gone before us, that has led us to be here today, everyone in the room, and all the people that are going to come after us as well, to whom we are responsible. My contribution today is I'm going to talk about an empirical project which investigated animal welfare awareness of companion species, guardians, pet owners, but I'm going to call them guardians, in New Zealand. And I'm going to talk about one paper in this larger project. It's now completed. So my purpose is to provide an example of an empirical project that uses posthumanist concepts, specifically decentering the human and providing an expanded conception of the subject. So rather than focus specifically on anthropomorphism, I'm talking about subjectivity, to show how posthumanism can be used in analysis of empirical research. So in this paper, we conducted a narrative analysis of stories told by guardians. The Māori word for that is kaitiaki. It has a slightly wider meaning than guardians, and definitely a different meaning from owners, about their fairy family or their fairy whānau. So the difference between these words, family and whānau, guardians and kaitiaki, are important, and I'm going to return to those concepts at the end. So what you can see there, that's not a picture of my cat, but when I did have a cat, Ripley, an elegant, black, sleek pillar of insects, rats, mice and birds, she once brought a bed tui into our living room. This is a live one. It's a picture of a live one. And I can still see in my mind's eye, and I always will, her self-satisfied face as she presented this beautiful but dead native bird to me, no doubt thinking she was being a good provider. It's excuse me, the poetry here. Its iridescent feathers shone in the sun, just so, like in the picture. They're gorgeous when you see them close up. And I felt torn about whether I should put that cat down or not. Understand that I loved her, but I also loved birds. So my horror from that day stayed with me and triggered writing I've done about animal-human relations in the context of Aotearoa, where I'm from, including this paper. So it's these wider relations of species entanglements with each other, They're really recognised and definitely management research where I'm from, and often not either in companion animal research where this research is centred. So wider species relations are often not discussed, but although post-humanist ideas are being increasingly used, so that's where this paper aims to contribute. So the purpose was to improve the lives, the research of companion animals by understanding animal welfare issues in Aotearoa from the perspective of their guardians. The original project was conceived by scientists using a One Welfare Aotearoa approach and funded by the Companion Animal Society. One Welfare is a development of One Health. I'm not sure if you've heard of One Health before, but it's a collaboration between medical and veterinary professionals to better understand connections between animal and human health. For instance, as already mentioned, in farming systems, use of antibiotics, zoonotic diseases and so on. One Welfare is informed by the 5 Freedoms model, that is that animals should be free from hunger and disease, discomfort and pain, injury, disease, and they should have the freedom to express their natural behaviour. So before I move on and talk in a little bit more detail, I just wanted to highlight one thing that does make post-humanist research post-humanist, and that's subjectivity, or a different way of thinking about subjectivity. So post-humanism sees subjectivity as open and porous and always becoming with others. It sees identity, I think, as something that's more softly held in relation to others. It can be quite a difficult thing for people to move away from. And so if you've got any questions, I can talk a little bit more about it in relation to Pākehā identity in New Zealand, which I think is another connection that I can make. This human, non-human relations are descended from the human and human agents, so the life forces of non-human species. Their specific morphologies, behaviours and life worlds are given space in research. So for instance, imagine walking a dog and you transpose yourself into the dog's world of sensory experience, understand how they experience their walk with their noses as they're walking with them. And there's a couple of great papers about dog walking in the animal studies literature. Similarly with a cat, there's much debate about cat containment, which I'm going to come back to in the end, which comes from different perspectives as well on how cats' natural instincts to roam and hunt are curtailed by containment, thereby constraining cats' freedom. And you see this is cruel. That said, data I talk about today was generated by an online survey using a snowball sampling technique. So obviously companion species could not answer this online survey. It's usually the site of companion animals research is with a ethnographic, so that or an interview based, so that researchers can capture that whole gamut of sexual and body relations, including animal voices, which can then be represented in albeit human language. Nevertheless, the data set of stories that we used in this analysis was very rich, and narrative analysis is a common approach in human animal studies. And through analysing stories, we can appreciate the significance and nuances, I think, that post-humanism can bring to analysis. So we frame the analysis using previous scholarship, exploring companion animal kinship relations, and engaging with ethics. And we looked at this larger data set of stories. There were over 500 told by guardians of companion animals using a genre discourse approach. So I can talk more about the analysis method if you like, but in brief, our findings emphasise the everyday affective, reciprocal and intimate entanglement between guardian, companion and animal relations. And that is consistent with other research about companion animals and their guardians. And we, in the paper, we talk about a new genre, calling it the subgenre of domestic drama, any of you that have animals and stories will immediately recognise the subgenre, the family stories that are told and passed on about favourite family pets. Often they can go from generation to generation. And we just call this northern human domestic drama. The structure of the genre is it's woman-centred. It's affective in nature, and the moral theme is co-constituted reciprocal care, which is one of the ethical discourses that we identified in the most prominent ethical discourse that we identified in these stories. So the 4 ethical paradigms that we did use were animal welfare, I mentioned before about the 5 freedoms, animal rights, which is recognising that animals have rights and that they have subjective lives and so on. And relational, which the lack of storytelling is really what I'm going to come back to, the relational ethics, which is about interspecies dynamics and incorporates historical perspectives and is particularly attuned to place, ethnic discourses, gender and things like that. I just have a few points I just want to make about subjectivity in relation to this study that I think are quite important. So just to reiterate that post-humanism sees subjectivity as open, porous and always becoming with others. So human, non-human relations are descended from the human and human agency, and space is given to life forces of non-human in there. So as I mentioned, relational ethics were neglected, which I think is, I'm going to circle back to that. Our study reinforces the usefulness of narrative and story analysis of all kinds as an important avenue for understanding multi-species relations and the ethical issues that arise, including for new forms of life, which are being manufactured now as we speak, and which we look at in another paper about speculative fiction and journal of business ethics. I'm not talking about that one today. So the family is a key site. It's really the main place that most people have relationships with animals, and they learn about animals, and they learn about ethical relations and how to behave with animals. So in our particular study, the participants were predominantly older women who identify as New Zealand European, because those are the people that tend to answer surveys about animal welfare issues. One reason that we wrote about domestic drama was to affirm the women who do the everyday care of companion species in domestic contexts. So the genre of domestic drama and care is gendered, and every time I talk to people about analysing these stories, scientists mainly, they all would roll their eyes and say, oh, it's mainly this particular cohort that answered the survey, as if that made it less relevant. So I did want to make a positive thing out of this. That was definitely part of what I wanted to do when I looked at this data. So I just wanted to make the point too that multi-species relations informed by this porous becoming relations, which is the way that we talk about subjectivity in this context, isn't not necessarily ethical in and of themselves. Although the home is a key place for developing and understanding of animal welfare issues, I think that one thing that, reflecting on the study, we need to understand and imbue our understandings with the specificities of place, species, gender and cultural differences. And this can be seen, as I just close, on the difference between the words family and whānau, kaitiaki and guardian as well. So the family, for example, in the taken for granted sense that most of us understand today, are continuously changing, socially constructed kinship systems, which evolves through cohabitation and other socially recognised bonds, such as fostering, nursing or economic ties. Usually there's something that's seen of as being placed in the home or a house, and family can include other species in this context, and that's where most research about companion animals is centred. However, if we think about the word whānau and kaitiaki or guardianship and responsibility also to others, which is a Maori words. They've got a much wider and more flexible meaning. It's not dependent on the home or house and immediate cohabitation to define its boundaries. It's much more flexible and it can be used in different contexts to describe practically anybody. I think also if we think about the difference between these two words, it also reminds us that these relations are also dependent on the specific relations that different groups, New Zealand European women, for example, and Maori, have with different animals. It's not to say that, so anyway, so we do explore this in another paper because of the narrowness of the participants in this particular study. We did another study which was with, for and by Maori, which looked at their relationships with their dogs, where they brought in, and it was in lower socioeconomic areas, where they brought in their dogs and they did a health check with their dogs and collected data that way. And we wrote another paper about that looked at the Maori relationship with the kuri, which is the native dog, but also just a general term for dog in New Zealand, and how historically that relationship has occurred. To look also at some of the dimensions around animal welfare and some of the differences that they have.